Let's suppose you finish the biggest series of your life with an ending that feels complete. The story is wrapped up, the characters have closure, and the natural next step is to move on. But then, only a year later, you go back and write a sequel to the work you had already brought to a satisfying conclusion. So what do you get from that choice? Why would this new story work? That is the story of Fairy Tail 100 Years Quest. Anime has many sequels that are either lackluster or poorly received. Many of these fail because they lose sight of what makes the original compelling. A sequel can't succeed by simply continuing the story. It has to do more than that. It needs to preserve what made the original work in the first place. For a sequel to be successful, it has to maintain the soul of the original series. Almost every core element of it has to be the same, and it has to really feel like it's just like the original. So the important elements like characterization, humor, relationships, theme, and plot have to be the same as the original, especially characterization, relationships, and world building. So if a sequel series feels like a completely different show that is only wearing the franchise of the original series as a skin suit, then it has failed to live up to its goals. Of course, it's usually a lot easier to do this if the same people that made the original are also making the sequel. So a good sequel has to feel like a natural extension of the original story, rather than something extra and possibly different slapped on as an afterthought. So a good sequel must preserve the foundational things that made the original what it was. The second element of a good sequel is that it can't undermine or throw off the ending of the original series. If the way a sequel does things undoes a carefully crafted narrative ending, then it isn't a good sequel. It has already done enough damage to the entire franchise before it even really gets going, and so cancels out many of the other positives it may have had. Many sequels have been criticized as having too little to do with the original story, or completely undoing a hard-won, meaningful ending by throwing in some shenanigans that completely negate the importance of everything that happened up to that point. The biggest hazard is making it too different from the original, but completely undermining the ending. Can also set a show up for failure. The point is, for a sequel to have any chance of being successful and truly well received, it can't do either of these things as a minimum. So to understand why Fairy Tail 100 Years Quest works as a sequel, we first need to look at what made the original Fairy Tail successful, and before that we need some background on the series. Fairy Tail began publication in 2006 and was written by Hiro Mashima. The series ran in Weekly Shonen Magazine from 2006 to 2017, and received an anime adaptation from 2009 to 2019. Hiro Mashima began his career as a manga artist in 1998, and started publication of his first big series, Rave Master, in 1999. 100 Years Quest premiered 1 year after the conclusion of Fairy Tail. So by the time 100 Years Quest premiered, Mashima was a veteran of the industry of almost 20 years. Fairy Tail is a great series because its core appeal comes from its characters and their emotional development. Many characters begin with painful or traumatic histories, and their stories focus on how they overcome those experiences through emotional growth. The series has excellent character relationships and interpersonal dynamics, with both friends and enemies having interactions that create meaningful emotional conflicts. As a result, the characters' drama is one of the central strengths of the series, and in that sense, Fairy Tail is less focused on being a purely fight-driven battle shonen, and more focused on character-driven storytelling, where conflicts are often resolved through personal growth and emotional development. A repeated theme throughout the series is characters confronting their past and growing beyond their struggles. And don't give me, but the characters receive sudden power-ups at the last second, and that makes the fights lousy and the series bad. All battle shonen are like that. Well, most of them. In most of these series, characters receive a sudden power-up or escalation at the last second because the plot demands it. It's easier to list battle shonen that don't do this instead of having more logical, consistent fight mechanics. In most of these series, a character often pulls a victory out at the last second because they need to win. So I'm not really disagreeing in principle, I'm just calling out selective outrage. It's one of the reasons I'm often unimpressed with anime fights. A lot of the time, they don't make sense, and the character is just going to find some I win button at the last second. There are some anime series that do fight in a logical, consistent way that makes sense, but that's a discussion for another day. So the point is, Fairy Tail is being judged more harshly than peers, on a metric those peers also frequently fail to live up to. It does not matter what kind of word salad or technobabble other series use to handwave away sudden victories and put a fig leaf over faulty, inconsistent fight mechanics. As a sequel, 100 Years Quest performs solidly on both these two factors we originally talked about, but to analyze how the sequel relates to the ending of the original series, I'm going to have to talk about the actual ending of Fairy Tail, so there will be spoilers. You can skip ahead to the time on screen if you want to avoid them. At this point, I've only watched the anime of 100 Years Quest, so I'm unaware of any later developments that might have happened in the manga. The sequel doesn't undermine the ending and achievements of the original series. The threat of the Alvarez Empire is permanently dealt with and solved, Zeref and Mavis stay dead, and their eternal peace isn't undermined, Acnologia stays dead, and doesn't come back to life. Urza's mother also remains physically dead. The dragons also pass on and aren't brought back to life. Juvia Lockstar and Gray's romantic dynamic is neither undone or rushed, but continues to advance slowly and steadily, and most importantly, the world is saved, and the stakes for the next story in the sequel are much lower, or they travel to an entirely different world completely, and the action happens there, and deal with the threat to it there. And the character's happy ending isn't really disturbed, because they are doing what they really wanted to do all along as the adventure continues. The series continues the same character dynamics, characterizations, and relationships as the original series, just with some additional organic character development, so it's, at its core and heart, still the same creature. Obviously, when the original author writes it, it is more likely to succeed on the first metric of staying true to the original, but even the original author can still fail the second metric by undermining the ending of the first series, so sequels must preserve the foundational things that made the original what it was, while not undermining the original ending. There have been many sequels that have been poorly received, like Dragon Ball GT, Boruto, Saint Seiya Omega, Kogi's Lucia the Resurrection, and Yashahime, and I'll focus on Yashahime. I'm not trying to put down Yashahime. I liked it well enough for what it was, but it's the only one of these series I have actually seen, so it's going to have to be the one I look at as an example of what can go wrong with doing a sequel. I'm not saying it was that bad for what it was supposed to be. So conversely, Yashahime and many other series don't do as well on these metrics. So I honestly did like Yashahime well enough, but the series had a lot of issues with it, so I do get why people don't like it. The plot doesn't make complete sense, and it's hard to keep track of, and the story has inconsistent characterization with a lot of the characters, so they seem to be behaving in ways that contradict their earlier behaviors just for the convenience of the plot. Yashahime shifts too far away from the tone and emotional center of Inuyasha, while also weakening the continuality of the original ending. Yashahime has a significantly more different feel from the original compared to 100 Years Quest's relationship with the original fairy tale. The series has a much greater focus on the internal political mechanizations of clans, the arrangements of government officials, and the internal operations of businesses and arrangements of business relationships. So the sequel has a completely different feel from the original and feels much more bureaucratic. You don't want to make a series that's supposed to be a zany comedy bureaucratic. I'm not saying you can't make a good series about government bureaucracies and the internal operations of business, but it should be done in a serious series where that is the main point of the show, and the mechanizations of such things should not be placed there if they are just going to distract from the story's actual focus and restrict the flexibility of the story, and not be used to tie down a series that's supposed to be silly, whimsical, or humorous. And putting the two former lead characters in suspended animation for decades and leaving their daughter abandoned to be raised by wolves doesn't do any favors to help the original ending. Conversely, one reason Dragon Ball Super works much better as a sequel is that it takes place before the original ending of Dragon Ball Z, so it starts in a better position because it can't undo the original ending if it takes place in a point before the ending actually happens. Ultimately, a sequel succeeds not because it is bigger or more ambitious than the original, but because it understands what made the original work in the first place. Fairy Tail 100 Years Quest succeeds because it continues the same character dynamics, themes, and sense of adventure without undoing the emotional conclusions of the first series. A good sequel feels like the original, and not a completely different story borrowing the same name. That is why, despite the challenges that come with continuing a finished series, 100 Years Quest works as a natural extension of Fairy Tail. So in conclusion, if Mashima brings any characters from Fairy Tail back to life, it should be Celia, in her full demon form, and the real Celia, not just Mary Jane wearing her violated corpse as a skin suit.